Kala Library in collaboration with Faculty of Islamic Study, Universitas Islam International Indonesia, or UIII. My name is Huria from University of Indonesia, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to invite the Dean of the Faculty to give remarks. Please welcome Pak Yanuar.
Okay, thank you, Bu Huria. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I would like to thank the Yusuf Kala Library for making the collaboration with Faculty of Islamic Studies. And I also would like to thank Stefan Lacroix. Stefan Lacroix actually will be introduced by the moderator, but I'm very happy to introduce him because not only he's a visiting lecturer at Faculty of Islamic Studies in UI3, but he's also been very active in contributing to the university itself, so not only within the Faculty of Islamic Studies. And today's book forum is special because this is the, let's say, the first discussion, right, Steph? So this is the first discussion of the book, which will be published by Columbia University Press. I think it will be issued next month, right? So, yeah, next month, August 5. So before it is published by Columbia University Press, UI3 is holding its book forum of the book itself. So this is an honor for us to have, this very interesting book series featured not only, the significant book on Salafism in contemporary Egypt, but also because the author himself is present here and has been very well established, very active, very contributing, visiting lecturer to our university. And we also would like to thank Pak Muhammad Al-Merekebi, our lecturer at the Faculty of Islamic Studies. He is supposed to have a holiday in Egypt, so he's supposed to fly to Egypt tonight, but due to his strong commitment, he would like to extend his stay during this holiday, because he said that I still have more students, to supervise. Yeah, to supervise. So we are very proud to be your college, Muhammad, because of your dedication. And the moderator is special because she is imported from UI, our neighbor, because apparently Stefan wanted her to be the moderator. He said, first to make it gender balance, at first he wanted me to be the moderator. I said, no, it will be all male panel. And then I know Bunina will not be happy with it. So that's why Bunina, we have at least one. Although one, but still there is representation of women in this forum. So sorry, Stefan, even though you would like me to become the moderator, I really refuse to do so. And then your choice is great because not only Bu Huria is a woman, but she's a very active political scientist from UI. She just finished her postdoctoral activities at Boston University, collaborating with Professor Robert Hefner. So also please give applause to her. So I think you will continue the discussion, Bu Huria. You will introduce the speakers. Maybe you will also give some highlights about the book itself. So my duty is like, as Pak Stefan says, to give little bit sambutan. So that's it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the book forum and have a productive session today. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Mas Yanuar. This is how I used to call him. Usually in campus we don't really say Pa and Bu. We say Mas. That's why lecturers always stay young forever. Right, Mas Yanuar? Okay, Bapak dan Ibu semuanya, rekan-rekan, this afternoon we'll be diving into a powerful and timely book, as Pak Yanwar already mentioned, titled Twilight of the Saints, The History and Politics of Salafism in Contemporary Egypt, by our special guest today, Dr. Stephen Lacroix from SINSPO. I hope I'm not mistaken. And unfortunately, none of us here have the hard copy of the book because Stephen said the book is still in France, so we have to bear waiting for the book to be distributed in Indonesia, hopefully soon, Stephen. But the book gives us a rich and layered picture of how Salafism has evolved in Egypt, from its theological roots to its complex political journey, especially in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And even though the book focuses on Egypt, the themes it raises strongly resonate with what happened here in Indonesia. As we all know, since the 1998 Reformasi, we've seen the growing visibility and influence of the Salafi movement in Indonesia. Their emergence has posed new challenges and even sharp critics to the Indonesia's two dominant Islamic organizations, the traditional Nahdlatul Ulama and also Muhammadiyah, which has long represented a modernist reformist thread. Salafism positioned themselves as purists, or we call it a scripturalist Muslim. This movement has introduced new challenges and also tension within Indonesia's diverse and historically plural Islamic landscape. But interestingly, this mirrored dynamics in Egypt too, as explored in Stephen's book. There in Egypt, Salafi movements have challenged long-standing religious authorities and also moved from a quietist position to a more politically engaged one, especially in the wake of the Arab Spring. So although the context is different, both Egypt and Indonesia reflect a broader question that will be explored by Stephen in his book. How do scripturalist movements like Salafi reshape Islamic discourse in times of social and political transition? This is what we would like to hear from Stephen. And today we are truly honored to have with us the author himself, Dr. Stephen Lacroix, a renowned scholar in political science, whose work on Islam and politics has shaped academic debates around the world. If you check his name on Google, he has a very long list of publications on Islam and politics. At least it is also proven by his high age index. It's 21, right? For us Indonesian, of course, age index is very important. And also, alongside with Stephen, we welcome Dr. Muhammad Al-Marakebi. He is a lecturer at the Faculty of Islamic Study, UI3, and also an Azharite scholar, if I can say that, who will serve as our discussion today. And hopefully, in this discussion, he will bring valuable insight to help us reflect further on the themes and implication of the book, and perhaps also its relevance with Indonesian context. So this is how we will plan the session today. First, we will hear from Stephen, who will share the main ideas behind his book for around 30 to 40 minutes. And then Dr. Al-Marakebi will over, or can I call you Muhammad? It's so much easier, right, for us? Okay, so Muhammad will offer his response and reflection, followed by a moderated conversation between them. And after that, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Lacroix to open today's forum and share his insight on Twilight of the Saint. Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bu Huria, Mbah Huria, I don't know how I should call you at this point, Dr. Huria. So thank you so much for this introduction. Thanks to thanks to UITIGA for hosting this seminar. Thanks to the library of UITIGA for inviting me to this book forum. Thanks to UITIGA for hosting me all this year. It's been a beautiful and extremely enriching year here in Indonesia and at UITIGA. Thanks to Pak Yanwar for being a great dean and for having been so welcoming, both during the year but in his speech. And thanks to Mohammed and Marakibi for accepting to discuss the book. I could not think of a better discussant, and I really mean it. Like, this is an honor and a pleasure to have Mohammed as a discussant, because I am a political sociologist who deals in Islamic studies, and I try to get as much as I can to the depths of Islamic studies while still being a social scientist. But I know that sometimes, you know, the people I'm most afraid of in discussions are people like Mohammed, because they are the ones, you know, we political sociologists, we tend to have a short-term perspective on things. You know, we look at the present, we look at just behind the present, and then we meet these historians who tell us, come on, this happened in the 15th century already, you know. So you're always scared of, you know, finding too much novelty in the contemporary and then speaking with people who have this kind of longue durée view and like, no, you know, we know this from before. So I'm very excited to, you know, to have the longue durée embodied in Mohammed as as discussing the book and making sure that hopefully I don't go too much astray when it comes to the more hardcore material in Islamic studies. So now to say something about the book itself, right? So this is a book which is really about religious change. In that book, what I try to understand is, over a century in Egypt, how what I call the religious norm has transformed. So what I mean by that is that what used to be considered orthodox 100 years ago in Egypt is no longer. And new understanding of what is orthodox have replaced those conceptions. So it's trying really to get into this battle for hegemony within the Islamic sphere, between competing ideas. So this is really a book, in a sense, about the battle of ideas, right? And it's a book that tries to understand a shift which, in some way, has been a global shift. That what I mean is that these Salafi conceptions within Islam have gained ground over the last century, not just in Egypt. Although not in the same way and to the same extent everywhere. And that's also a very interesting question. And Egypt has been one place in which that change has been pretty visible, pretty obvious, right? And so the book tries to take, like, the approach of a century to try to understand how religious conceptions change, or conceptions of what is considered orthodox change over a century. So this is not a book, let me be clear about this first. This is not a book about extremism or moderation. Those are not the terms that I use. It's not a book about violence. To me, those are different things. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about different ways of approaching what is considered theologically sound or theologically incorrect within a religion. And those have practical consequences, right? I mean, it is true that the rise of Salafism has had some social consequences. Maybe if you look at one topic, which is the question of religious diversity, right? The rise of Salafism has certainly had a negative impact on the acceptance of religious diversity, because Salafis tend to be people who would be less inclined towards religious acceptance of minorities. But this doesn't mean that it's about violence or anything. Right? It just changes the way social relationships are experienced. But the vast majority of Salafis in Egypt are perfectly peaceful people. We're not talking about people who are being violent. Right? So this is not about violence. But this is about changing social relationships based on changing perceptions of what is religiously orthodox. Right? So let me be clear, because this, again, and I say this especially in the West, but maybe also here sometimes, when these conceptions tend to be addressed in a normative way. I'm not being normative here. To me, this is not about, I'm not trying to look at the good Muslims and the bad Muslims and divide them and say those are the good ones and the bad ones. It's not about this at all. It's about trying to understand the process. And then it's for each of you, depending on your own expectations, on your own beliefs, to consider whether this is good or bad. But it's not my point to describe something in normative terms. So the idea then is to try to understand that shift. And the book starts with what I think is something that has been missing quite a bit, which is an effort at trying to define what we're talking about. Because there's been a lot of misunderstandings when we use these terms. So in the book, I make a clear distinction between Salafism and Islamism. And to me, those are two different things. And those are two different things because, and I'm not trying to be normative here again, but because practically they apply to two different movements that have taken shape more or less around the same time, with different orientations and different goals. Those movements have intersected with each other a lot, making the picture extremely blurry. The term Salafi itself has been used by a lot of people in very different contexts, which makes it even more blurry, right? And I think here in Indonesia, you would certainly hear the term in a different way. So what I'm talking here about is Egypt. So if you have understandings of what Salafi means in the indigenous context, it might be different from what I'm talking about, because that term Salafi is a very, I mean, how could I say, plastic term? Because in many ways, it means orthodox, right? I mean, in a sense, any Muslim would consider that practicing Islam or believing in Islam in the way the early Muslims did is the right thing to do. So in a sense, and some Salafis would say that sometimes every Muslim is Salafi, if you take that very broad definition. But then, the question is, this term has been used at times by certain movements within certain contexts for certain social, religious, or sometimes political reasons. And so this is very contextual then. So what I'm saying here is, applies to the context of Egypt and to the context of the Middle East maybe. But again, it may probably differ in the context of Southeast Asia or Indonesia. So again, take this into account when you listen to me, because you can't really apply this necessarily, and we'll talk about how this applies in different contexts, but you cannot really maybe apply these terms in the same way in another context like the one here. So the point that I tried to make it easy, right, is that in Egypt, in the late 19th century, a movement of Islamic revival started. Started not just in Egypt, in Syria as well. So the core of the Middle East. That movement I call Islamic reformism. Right? It's a movement that you know well because it had influence everywhere, including in Indonesia. This is the movement represented by people like Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi in Syria. I mean, you had many names of that movement. So those were Islamic reformist intellectuals who were in a context of colonial domination, European encroachment, crisis of the Ottoman Empire that was just about to collapse. We're trying to rethink Islam as providing solutions to the crisis of the present. What I'm trying to say in the book is that this movement was, from the beginning, divided between two tendencies. Right? One tendency was political, and one tendency was religious. On the one hand, you had the people who believed that Islamic reformism was, first and foremost, about providing practical solutions to the problems of the Middle East, to the problems of the Arab countries or the Arab lands, to the problems that Muslims were facing globally. And for them, it was about the political renaissance, which would lead to the establishment, some of them would say, and that, people like Hassan al-Banna later on, who would form the Muslim Brotherhood, would say, this needs to lead to the formation of a state that is governed by Islam, and that would somehow replace the caliphate, right? And that is the term Islamic State that was actually coined by Rashid Rida and then taken over by Hassan al-Banna. So this was a political project that was aimed at providing a political solution. People like Hassan al-Banna were not so interested in theological debates. It was not about theology for them. It was about identity. So when these people understood Islam, they understood it as an identity. And an identity that should not be, that should be defined in a relatively broad way. Hassan al-Banna was himself a Sufi. He didn't care about having Sufis join his brotherhood. He did taqrib with the Shia, so he actually participated in initiatives to bring Sunnis and Shia together. So the idea was to try to unite Muslims beyond their differences within a common identity around a common political project, right? So that was the political side, right? And this is what would lead to the birth of al-Haraka al-Islamiyya in Arabic, which you can translate as Islamism. So Islamism is fundamentally the idea of a political project. And so in Islamism, in many ways, politics trumps theology. Theology is there, of course. It's not that they don't care about theology. But it's not theological disputes that motivate them. It's a common political goal. On the other end, at the other side of the Islamic reformist movement, you have people who were much more interested in theological disputes, who believed the solution to the problems Muslims were facing could only be found through a purification of the Islamic theology. These people thought that theological disputes were crucial. For them, it was about fighting against what they saw as blameworthy innovations, associationism, shirk. You guys would understand shirk. It's very difficult to say in English. I never managed to say associationism. It's very difficult to say. So for them, it was about that. Right? It was about this purification of what they saw as a theological message that, in their view, was not in line with what they considered to be Islamic orthodoxy. Those people are the Salafis of that movement. And for them, Islamic purity or religious purity was what was driving them. Their understanding of purity was itself constructed, as, construction in social science is what we work on, right? Because for them, purity was measured against the criteria of a number of authors who they believed to be the ones showing the direction of purity. So Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, for them, they represented the strain of purity. And so purification meant applying in the modern context what they read from these authors. So this was for them purity. This meant that they were much more hostile to what they saw as deviant forms of Islam. They would be very anti-Sufi, they would be very anti-Shi'i. For them, the idea was to redefine Orthodox Islam around a very strict Sunni basis that would not tolerate bid'ah or shirk. At the same time, these people were much less interested in politics. They believed that politics was not so important. Right? What mattered was to purify Muslim individuals' creed and to purify Muslim society, and that the political project would emerge by itself in a way once the purification had happened. So for them, working politically was never a goal. And most of the time, they would, one of them, to summarize this later on, there's a very famous Salafi sheikh, some of you might know, it's called Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani. In the 60s, Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani would kind of summarize that idea. with the term in Arabic, التصفية والتربية. So purification and education. Right? And this in many ways sums up the Salafi method. So on the one hand, you have some form of doctrinal rigidity and a method that is aimed at kind of a grassroots form of preaching that is aimed at purifying the creed, which is opposed on the other side to the more kind of Islamist tendencies, which are much more geared towards the political. Right? This is to me how, in the book I use different terms, I'm not going to maybe get into that. So the category, the theoretical tool I'm using is grammar of action. Right? So I distinguish Islamism and Salafism by what I call their distinctive grammars of action. Right? And the grammar of action of Islamism is political, the grammar of action of the Salafis is geared towards purity. Right? So, and I use this term of grammar of action because I'm trying to say that I don't like the term ideology. I think it's used too much and it's used in a way that is much too unconvincing. So I'm trying to find a way to look at what people are doing instead of looking at the idea that there's a clear ideology. So grammar of action is oriented towards studying practice, what people do, not just try to systematize what they say and figure out that there's like something called an ideology. So it is, the notion of grammar of action is really, in my sense, meant towards, again, trying to study people's practices, their actions, and what makes sense for themselves in their actions, how they understand what they're doing. But I'm not going to get too much into that. You can read that in the book later on. It's the kind of more theoretical part where I make this big discussion of grammar of action. So going back to what I'm saying here. In Egypt, this vision of Islamic reformism between one Islamist trend and one Salafi trend is very obvious. Happened in very obvious ways. Because the Muslim Brotherhood was created in 1928, and Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah, which is the first Salafi organization in Egypt, is created in 1926. So you have a 2-year difference between between the creation of the first systematic Islamist movement and the first systematic Salafi movement. And both of them work side by side with different goals, as we saw. They don't like each other, by the way, from the beginning. There are a lot of tensions between them. Because the brothers don't understand why the Salafis do not want to join them and why they don't get interested in politics. The Salafis believe the brothers are not good Muslims. They're not adhering to the proper creed. So there's a lot of debate and tension between those two groups from the beginning. The Muslim Brotherhood is not the subject of my book. It's been studied very much, and it's kind of my critique in many ways, right? I mean, everyone, there's a whole, if you read about Egypt, half of the books about Egypt are about the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And everyone has studied the relationship between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's like tens and tens and tens of books. This has been the main prism through which people have analyzed Egypt. And I think it is because, of course, it's spectacular. The Muslim Brotherhood and the state have clashed several times. People tend to be attracted by what is spectacular, scholars even. The Salafi movement is much more discreet. It's much less spectacular. It's about preaching. It's not about, it's not about doing demonstrations. It's not about, supporting mass movements. But what I try to say in my book is that you cannot understand religious change in Egypt in the 20th century if you don't reintroduce that element to the equation. So to me, it's not just a standby between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a triangle where you have the Muslim Brotherhoods, the Salafis, and the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhoods. Right? So those three are three poles of a triangle. And what is interesting is not the kind of dialectical relationship between the state and the Brotherhood. It is that more complex relationship between those three entities. So it is about the more complex relationship between those three distinct entities. Because one thing that is very obvious throughout my book is that because the Salafis were not political, at least from the point of view of the state, they were always seen as a much better alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood. So whenever, whenever there was a clash between the state and the Brotherhood, the Salafis would always be spared, because they would always be seen as much less threatening. In some cases, actually, and it's pretty obvious in the last decade of Mubarak's presidency in the 2000s, the Egyptian government actually supports the Salafis against the Brotherhood, because it tries to undermine the Brotherhood by supporting the Salafis, by promoting Salafism as some form of alternative religiosity to the religiosity of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is deemed much more threatening because it is political, right? So, in a sense, the Egyptian government doesn't really care about religious orthodoxy, doesn't really care about what people consider to be orthodox. What it cares about is maintaining its political power. So, of course, it fears much more from a group that threatens its political power than from a group that redefines orthodoxy. Right? So, the point that I make in my book is that because of a number of things, throughout the 20th century, the Salafis have been extremely effective. And I look at different stages, and those are the different chapters in the book. The first stage, I think, is very crucial, and we were discussing it with Mohammed before. It's what happened between the 1920s and the 1950s. It's very often overlooked. But this is extremely important, because from the 1920s to the 1950s, this is the moment of the birth of the religious printed book market. That is, this is when the Islamic books are no longer simply manuscripts kept in private libraries, or editions that are made in small numbers for ulama. Start to be sold within bookstores for a general audience, right? So this changes everything, because suddenly the Islamic literature becomes available to all, right? And it means that at this very moment, and other scholars have written about this, Ahmed al-Shamsi, of course, book on rediscovering the Islamic classics, which is a fantastic book, which I very strongly recommend to those of you who haven't read it. This is a very important moment, because the question becomes, what are we going to put on the bookshelves? And this is a fantastic moment for some of these revivalist movements to redefine what is orthodox. Because the question, most people do not know what is taught at Al-Azhar. What they know is what they find on top of the bookshelf when they go to the Islamic bookstore. So that moment is one in which the Salafis, that association called Ansar al-Sunnah Muhammadiyah, is extremely good, very entrepreneurial, at pushing for the authors it believes to be orthodox and put them on top of the shelves. There is a fantastic editorial effort, I mean, fantastic in the sense of immense publishing effort being undertaken by the Salafi movement in those years. So while the Muslim Brotherhood are busy organizing in, I don't know, clubs and syndicates and doing like 20th century politics, the Salafis are working on publication. They are publishing books. They are digging into the Islamic Torah to find books that correspond to their conceptions. This is the moment when some authors are becoming very mainstream. Someone like Ibn Taymiyyah is not mainstream before the 1920s. It is probably known to Islamic scholars. He is probably known to Islamic scholars, but he is considered quite marginal in the tradition that dominates the whole Ottoman period. And Ahmed al-Shamsi has a quote, I quote him in the book. He says, in the late 19th century, you couldn't even discuss Ibn Taymiyyah in Ottoman circles because people would just laugh at you. So this is interesting, right? That within a few decades, Ibn Taymiyyah would become a major reference. And that has a lot to do with the Salafi entrepreneurial publishing effort, right? So the Salafis are very good entrepreneurs. I mean, you could think of Max Weber's argument here, about the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism. There's the Salafi ethics and the spirit of capitalism going on. It's book market capitalism, but they're very good at it, right? Because, I give you an example. Right? They are the first to invent, and this is what Ansar al-Sunnah does, and then Al-Maktaba al-Salafiyya, which is linked to the same milieu of the Cairo Salafis. They're the first to invent the idea of dividing, these very long Islamic books of Torah, dividing them into very small booklets. You see that today, it's very common, right? Because if you want to read, I don't know, Tafsir ibn Kathir, it's very long. Only scholars would buy Tafsir ibn Kathir. But if you can sell Tafsir ibn Kathir by little parts, to very cheap prices, and you put them on the counter at the bookstore and people will take it, this is actually a very useful, very efficient way to get people to acquire these types of books in ways that they wouldn't probably, if, again, it was only the big book that was probably very intimidating to most people. So the Salafis understand new ways of marketing also the Islamic book. And they do it with the purpose of advancing a certain number of authors. So this is really the moment when you have a form of canonization of Ibn Kathir, who before that also, is the tafsir of Ibn Kathir before the 1920s is not very well known. Which is interesting because today probably most of you would consider it to be a very standard tafsir. But before the 1920s, it is not very well known. I was quoting this from having discussion with Muhammad. So Goldziher in 1924 writes a big book in German, 800 pages, about the history of tafsir in Islam. And he doesn't even mention Ibn Kathir in the 800 pages of that history of tafsir. So in 1924, Goldziher considers Ibn Kathir's tafsir to be so marginal to the grand tradition of tafsir in Islam that it doesn't even deserve a mention in an 800-page book. So this is very interesting because at the time, tafsir would mean for most people At-Tabari, Tafsir al-Jalalain, maybe Al-Baydawi. I mean, you could get into, Muhammad would know because Azharis know this better than me, but Al-Kathir would be considered marginal. So it's really interesting because you start to have a number of authors taking center stage. Now let's be clear here. Those are complex authors, right? And we were discussing this with Muhammad. The tafsir of Ibn Kathir is not per se a Salafi tafsir, just like Ibn Taymiyyah is also open to many different readings. But the Salafis would not just promote these books, they would promote these books with their ways of reading these books. Right? So they would promote a corpus, but they would also come up with a way of reading them. Which is why, another author who's written on that period, Ahmed Khan, which I quote in the book, and I quote one of his passage of his text in my book. Many of these Salafi editions were not just about printing a text. They were about the introduction, the footnotes. Right? So it was about, you could take, I think he gives the example of a little booklet that was 15 pages long, which could be printed as a 400-page long book. All the rest was the footnotes and the introduction, and everything to make sure that you read the book the way the editor wants you to read the book. So it's not just about the books, it's about the way you read the books, the difference between the book and the way you read a book. There's scholars like Yahya Michaud, who was a great, a very great scholar of Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, who, until the end of his life, Yahya Michaud, I think he died last year, he passed away last year, who completely disagreed with anything the Salafis say about Ibn Taymiyyah. He spent his life saying, they don't understand Ibn Taymiyyah. They just imposing their reading on it. He didn't say that. So you can also have disagreements about these authors. But it's about promoting certain authors and then promoting a certain reading of these authors. This was a very important moment because within a few decades, these books would certainly, the Salafi corpus would start to have a very strong positioning within the field of the Islamic book market. And this continued because, as I said, when in Egypt, after the period of the monarchy, in 1952, there is revolution, which leads to Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers taking power, clashing with the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you know that story. But Gamal Abdel Nasser doesn't care about the Salafis, because the Salafis are not political. So while the clash with the brothers happened and the Brotherhood is persecuted, sent to jail, the Salafis continue publishing books. They continue writing and publishing. So what is interesting is that throughout all these periods, the Salafis always kind of strive. Which is why in the late 60s, when you start to have the Islamic revival, which starts in Egypt as, in many other countries, the Islamic revival in Egypt starts from reading of the Salafi books mostly. And it starts from some of these Salafi spheres that have persisted in society throughout the Nasser era. So when Islamic activism is reborn in the 70s in Egypt, it is a very different form of Islamic activism from the one of the 20s. It is Islamic activism with a Salafi flavor. If you compare the rhetoric of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 30s and the Islamic activism of the 70s, you can clearly see the difference, right? In terms of, again, in terms of attitude to Sufism, in terms of attitude to Christians. It's a big question in the case of Egypt because Egypt has 10% Christian, 90% Muslims. So Egypt also has this kind of majority-minority question. All of this in the 70s, the rhetoric changes because the new Islamic activism is born from a different theological basis. In the 80s, the Salafi movement, I mean, in the late 70s, sorry, there's an important moment when, I hope I'm not being too long. I know I am. 10 minutes more. In the late 70s, there is a very important moment in Egypt which leads to the formation of the first Salafi social movement. It's called the Dawah Salafiyah. And Dawah Salafiyah is different from Ansar al-Sunnah. Ansar al-Sunnah was a group of ulama who were basically publishing books, doing ulama work. They were scholars. It was kind of a league, a council of scholars. When the Dawah Salafiyah is born in the late 70s, it is born in a context of growing Islamic activism. And it's the idea of making Salafism a social movement. That is, basically taking the methods of the Islamists, but not the politics of the Islamists. So organizing from the grassroots into a very strong kind of social movement with a grassroots presence, quite organized, to make the Salafi ethos of preaching not just anymore, how could I say, teacher to pupil, but something that's kind of a more organized, nationwide effort. And this continues in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And there's a number of reasons why this continues on the last of these periods, which is the period of Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak comes to power in 1981. He stays in power until 2011 for 30 years. And during that period, you have a number of factors that explain why the Salafis also continue to become stronger. One of them I mentioned before is basically the regime playing the Salafis against the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very clear in the Mubarak period. Right? And I've really, in the book, I document very obvious strategies to, like micro-local strategies where, the government would support Salafi movement here because they think the Muslim Brotherhood is too strong here to undermine them. So you have a clear strategy of trying to rebalance the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood by the Salafis in that period. Of course, there's a second factor which maybe many of you have been thinking of, and like you've been wondering why didn't they mention Saudi Arabia to this point? Because I don't think it's that important, by the way. I think it is important at certain moments, but it's not as important as people believe. Right? I think there's a whole hype about, it's all about Saudi Arabia. The Egyptian context is much more complicated. The initial Salafi movement at the time of Ansar al-Sunnah did have ties to Saudi Arabia. It's true. It was the 1920s, so it was not Saudi Arabia that had a lot of money with oil and that could fund movements in the way it probably later did. And in the 80s, you have that thesis, for instance, that a lot of Egyptians became Salafi because they went to work in Saudi Arabia. My work shows that the contrary is probably also true. A lot of Egyptians went to work to Saudi Arabia because they were already Salafi. So it was the Salafi connection that brought them to Saudi Arabia many times. So that idea that, people went to work and then suddenly their religiosity changed because they were in Saudi Arabia and then they came back as Salafis, actually is probably not completely true. And in many cases it is not. It kind of ignores the fact that Salafism at this point had become an endogenous Egyptian movement. Right? It was not something that was no longer important from abroad. It had developed very strong roots in society. People believed that this conception was correct. And so, at least a lot of people did. And so what happened then is that, of course the Gulf still mattered. The fact that Salafism was strong in the Gulf, many of these Salafi movements in Egypt would be able to benefit from that collaboration with Gulf countries. I don't know, some would, I give many examples in the book and I cannot give, one question for the Salafis, for instance, in Egypt, was that there were a lot of jobs they couldn't do as Salafis. They couldn't work in tourism, which is a big provider of jobs in Egypt. The Salafi won't work in tourism because you might be exposed to sin. You will be exposed to, I don't know, foreign women who might, not follow the rules that you believe in. So tourism was out of the game. Most Salafis also would be very skeptical about working for the government because they would think that again, they may have to do things. So many of them were actually out of quite a number of sectors which were big job providers in Egypt. The fact that the Gulf provided jobs was key to sustain them. Many Salafis, for instance, became people who did import-export with Saudi Arabia. That was a big thing. They would work with Saudi companies. They would work in businesses connected to either Hajj, but also to Islamic books, Islamic charities, Islamic banking. So there was a whole sector that was connected to the Gulf that would provide a livelihood to many of these people who would not do other jobs. So the Gulf was really important in that. But again, I don't like this naive idea that the Gulf can just impose ideas upon people. I think ideas have a very long life. They take time to get rooted in places. It's not just like this very easy idea that the 70s oil, Saudi Arabia, Salafism, they just promoted it everywhere and that's what happened. It has a much longer history, and people know what they're doing. It's also making people much too naive to think that people will just change their religiosity so quickly because suddenly, it's that. It was a much longer process in Egypt, one that had much stronger roots. This is what I'm trying to say here. There's other factors, and I can't explore them all that I'm looking at in the book. One of them was that, talk about the Azhar a little bit in the book, because I think in many ways the Salafis were much more entrepreneurial than the Azharis. The Azharis were constrained by the state, which was state with a very strong control over the Azhar, especially in the 60s. And so that meant that the Azharis were not as active, as entrepreneurial, as motivated as many of these Salafis were. So the religious sphere at this point, had some kind of, what could I say, space to be filled. And the Salafis came right at the time when they could fill that space. That the Azharis were no longer in a capacity to fill, that the Muslim Brotherhood was not willing to fill because the Muslim Brotherhood was more interested in trying to get seats in the parliament. So this is where the Salafis also managed to, again, I always look at these kind of relational type of sociology. To me, you always have to understand, it's like physics, right? When one part of the edifice moves, there's always something replacing. You always have to think of the social world as physics. Substances move, atoms move, and when there's a void, another fills the void. So religious change worked that way too, right? In Egypt, the Salafis were really good because of that too, right? Because there was a void. There was a demand for religion that no other Islamic actor was in a capacity to fill at this point, right? So I'm going to stop here with a very rapid conclusion because I've been too long. But I think it's pretty obvious that you see that, 2011 is really a test of how hegemonic the Salafi religious discourse has become in Egypt. Because in 2011, you have this Egyptian revolution that brings down Hosni Mubarak, and you have elections. And suddenly, you have a Salafi political party being formed, which no one expected because Salafis were never interested in politics. So at the time, no one understands what's going on. Salafis have always said, tasfiyah wa tarbiyah, not interested in politics. We do preaching. Suddenly, they create a party. And I explain in the book why they create a party, but I'm not going to get into that because I've been too long. Maybe we'll go back in the questions. So why would the Dawah Salafiyah, the big Salafi movement I mentioned before, create a party? Is another question I'm not going to address here because I would be too long. But what's interesting is that that party, created 3 months before the elections, gets 28% of the vote. And everyone's like, where did this come from? Like, okay, 45% for the Muslim Brotherhood. Everyone knew they were very strong. Everyone expected that in many ways. But the Salafis, how did this come from? So, in many ways, my book started as a way to try to respond to that question. Where did this come from? And in the 2012 presidential election, for a while, the far-runner candidate is a Salafi candidate. It's called Hazm Salah Abu Ismail, and he is a forerunner for a while. Then something happens with, I mean, the Egyptian revolution is full of these events. The Electoral Commission finds out that his mother has acquired American citizenship. And he gets eliminated from the race for that. Right? And he contests and says it's not true, although his parents were political exile in the US. So there's a long story, but anyway, he gets eliminated from the race. But it's interesting that the forerunner for a while was himself a Salafi candidate. The Brotherhood, even in that context of the post-2011, they considerably Salafized their discourse to compete with the Salafis. I think, and I will just finish here, I think this is very important because understanding the normative hegemony, this is the term that I use, of Salafism in 2011, is really important to understand many of the things that happened during that period of 2011-2013. Because this fueled political polarization in Egypt. Right? And it's very obvious if you compare Egypt to Tunisia. Right? If you go back to the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, very different trajectories. Because in Tunisia, what you had was the classic divide. A secular bloc, an Islamist bloc, more or less half and half. Right? 40% for the Islamists, 60% for the different versions of the secularists in Tunisia. So they would end up making alliances. They create the first government, which was in Tunisia, called the Troika, which included the Islamists and then the centrists, and a Labour Party together within a coalition, so two secular parties with one Islamist party within a coalition. In Egypt, things didn't happen that way because there were two religious forces, not one. And that's very important. And the Salafis were playing the game of religious bidding, like basically constantly accusing the Brotherhood of not being Islamic enough. So the Brotherhood could not basically look for alliances at the center of the game because it was constantly challenged to its rights by actors who pretended to be more religious than it was. So that drove the Brotherhood, instead of trying to make like a centrist type of bloc, where it could ally with more secular forces like the Tunisian state, and try to stabilize things. The Brotherhood in Egypt was driven by this competition with the Salafis. And that led to the Brotherhood becoming more conservative, the two of them kind of trying to outbeat each other in conservatism, and leading to a complete polarization of the two blocs. And eventually, the secular bloc, in the case of Egypt, deciding that they didn't want to play the democratic game any longer, and turning to the army for help. Right? And that's how the government of President Morsi was eventually overthrown. By a coalition supported by the army that included many of these forces that had decided that they didn't want to play the democratic game any longer. So this is very different from Tunisia. So I think that this kind of bidding game that happened with that Salafi element is really important to understand also why the democratic transition in Egypt ended the way it did. Those are many things I've talked about here. The book is very dense. I tried to give you some ideas about it. There's much more in the book, by the way, and I'll finish here because I've said too much. And of course, I'm open to more questions and eager to listen to Mohammed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. That was very compelling presentation. So now let's turn to our discussion. Dr. Muhammad Al-Markabi, to offer your comments and also open up for conversation.
Thank you very much, Buharia. Thank you very much, Stephen, for this amazing presentation of your work. It's my honor and my pleasure today to be a discussant with this very important book that's actually almost simultaneously is or will be released in 3 languages. So it was initially published in French, and now with the Columbia University, the English version and the Arabic version has already been translated, and it's about to be published very soon by one of the publishers. Probably I don't need to release that now. And it's an honor for me to be one of the first readers of this great book. Thank you very much. I didn't need to pay for that. I enjoyed reading the whole book. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very nice. So I had the honor to read the book in PDF form. Thank you for your trust and for sending the book. And for me, it's impressive work. It's a great book that actually is quite different from any other book that has been written about Salafism in Egypt. One of its distinctive advantage is that it covers a very long period. So usually social scientists will usually focus on one person. Someone will publish about Rashid Rida, someone about Hilali, someone about Arab Spring, someone. But here it covers a very long period. So for me, that's a very good book to be a reference for students to understand not only one specific time, but also the development, the transformation, the changes, the continuity that's happening for the Salafi or Salafism in Egypt throughout probably more than a century. And Stephen actually depended on a very important primary sources, that actually some rare primary sources. And that was like a little bit surprising for me because sociologists usually don't do that. They prefer interviews. But actually he did both job and did both job very well. And primary sources, historical studies on the early 20th century, but also interviews in the modern time, after the revolution and during the revolution, which actually it combines a lot. It's not only a social scientist study, but also he has a very good knowledge of Islamic studies, which again is very rare to find people, with all due respect, in social sciences who have such a deep knowledge of Islamic studies. So it's not true that he is afraid of Islamic studies scholars. He's a very he wrote that very well, actually. The interviews that he made, actually, he was a very fortunate, very lucky that he managed to find all of those people to accept to have interviews with him. Probably because he made that at the time of the revolution, so there was a very it was a time of freedom. Probably people were happy to speak up about their ideas. He made, I don't know how many people, probably 100 interview. I mean, beginning from the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar to some unknown activist. I mean, like, I think that the information, especially about the interviews, are very unique. And unfortunately, probably we cannot get that anymore. Some of those people you interviewed have already passed away. Muhammad Yusri Salama, Allah yarhamu, Sheikh Saeed Abdel Azim has passed away. Some of them are traveling. This is the term that we use in Egypt. Some of them are traveling, and some others, actually, I'm sure they will not be happy to speak up nowadays in this time. So it's very dense, very rich with the information that I don't think you can never find easily anywhere. And Stephen was actually very brave in such time, and going to Tahrir to meet people during the Tahrir. I mean, the demonstrations. I mean, that was really a very brave step. And definitely, it's not only historical and descriptive, but he introduced a very sociological insights, important insights in his work from his main discipline as a sociologist, which is something that again enrich the work itself, and it's very valuable. For example, when he discussed this idea of grammar of action, grammar of entrepreneur, all of these sociological discussions, getting from Bourdieu and other guys, actually it adds a lot of value to the book. The book, at least for me, although I'm Egyptian, I lived that issues myself. I mean, definitely not the early 20th century, but I lived after the revolution and before the revolution. It's something that I lived myself, but actually I should admit it corrected my perception to many things. So the explanation that he provided for the 28% that Salafis got in the election, which was surprising for everyone, his argument is very interesting that actually this didn't happen just right now. That has a century-long work by the Salafists that was largely unnoticed, that ended up with them gaining ground in such elections. So that argument is actually a very interesting argument when he discussed the relationship between the official Islam, the Salafis, and the official Islam, the Azharis, and the Salafis, and the relation between them in the early 20th centuries. The information that Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi was about to be deprived from his certificate, and that Sheikh Shaltut intervened to help him. That's actually complicates the scenario that we are living nowadays, where there is this very clear distinction between official Islam and Salafis, and the enmity is very clear cut. But actually, what you say is actually give a different perspective, which is very interesting. The way he discussed, for example, which was totally new for me, the influence of Salafists to the Islamists in the time of Abdel Nasser, because for me, time of Abdel Nasser was like a time of complete, like it was more as a vacant. But what he say is actually Salafists use this time of repression to Muslim Brotherhood to thrive and to grow. It was very surprising to know that Masjid al-Aziz Billah was built in that time. When you mentioned some people about Dr. Hilmi, that's Mustafa Hilmi, the manuscript in Alexandria, I think this invaluable addition in this book. That's it's even new to me and novel to me. So I really enjoyed reading that book. That book is impressive, and I think everyone, it's a must-read for everyone interested in Salafism in Egypt and Salafism in general. The way you divide, for example, the inheritance of Rashid Rida. I mean, that's a very symbolic way that Rashid Rida has two students, Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi and Hassan al-Banna, and Hassan al-Banna inherited that political part, and he inherited al-Manar, and then Rashid Rida, Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi completed his tafsir and inherited the theological part. I mean, this symbolic thing, I think I really enjoyed reading this division, this way of clear categorization between Salafism and Islamism. That was really impressive to me. So thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really great job. So I think the first point, if we will begin with the first chapter, Stephen has made an argument that Muhammad Abdu, he doesn't classify him as, I think everyone here knows Muhammad Abdu, that he doesn't classify him as a Salafi, because many academics in the Western academia will simply classify Muhammad Abdu as a Salafi. But I mean, for Egyptians, we don't do that. If you said Muhammad Abdu is a Salafi, people will frown at you. What are you saying? That doesn't makes much sense to us. And Stephen probably aligns himself with Egyptians nowadays, not with Western academics. He doesn't classify Muhammad Abdu as a Salafi, or in his own terminology, he doesn't fit with his own grammar of Salafism. So for him, Muhammad Abdu is a more modernist than, although he shares some of the some common ground with Salafism with regard to taqlid, with regard to mazhabism, but he doesn't do that when it comes to theology, for example, for sure. He's a more rational, he's a more pro-Mu'tazili, someone would say, or like reformist Ash'ari. But my question actually, Stephen, is how would you explain what you mentioned about the very good relationship between someone like Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi and the students of Muhammad Abdu? So you mentioned about the Shaltut case. You know, I'm not sure if you mentioned that in the book. Probably you mentioned that, but it's kept that one of the early publications of Majmu' Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah was published by Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi under the name of Fatawa al-Masriya, Mukhtasar Fatawa al-Masriya. And the editor that Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi approached to edit the Salafi Ibn Taymiyyah Fatawa was Abdul Majid Salim, who was the Mufti and the Grand, and later on the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar. And he said in the introduction of Majid Salim that I was approached by my friend Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi, and it's my honor to publish Ibn Taymiyyah's works. And so this close relationship between official Azhari, some people would claim actually, look, these people, Abdul Majid Salim or Shaltut or even al-Maraghi, were more inclined toward Salafism. Would you agree on that or not? And whether you think that this relationship between the students of Muhammad Abdu and the Salafists, how would you situate that within your categorization of Muhammad Abdu as a non-Salafist?
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You have more questions, right? So I should respond now one by one. Let's do it like a discussion. So this is when I should say thank you so much to begin with for everything you said. It's really, your opinion really matters a lot to me, so thank you very much. So your question, I think this is another of these things that needs to be clarified. Modernist and Salafi, at this point, in my understanding, are two different things. And again, Salafi is complicated to use because the term Salafi in that moment, the meaning is not still crystallized. So when we say Salafi, and that's why I say in the book, I use it kind of retrospectively, as you say. Like from the 1960s in the Arab world, when people say Salafi, they know exactly what it means. And it doesn't mean Muhammad Abdu. Right? But the way the term had been used in the 20s and 30s would be kind of more diverse. So in order to clarify things, we're kind of using Salafi in a kind of a retrospective way, right? Which is problematic in a way, but everything is problematic when trying to define such a difficult concept. But at least, if we use this Salafi way, use it that is retrospectively, Muhammad Abdu is not a Salafi because he is not driven by a grammar of purity. It's not about theological purity, right? And I think it's pretty clear that this isn't what drives him. What is interesting is that the Reformists and the Salafis, they agree on one thing. They don't like the traditionalists. And they don't like the traditionalists for different reasons. That is, what Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi sees as a bid'ah that is religiously forbidden because it is bid'ah, and end of the discussion. Muhammad Abdu would see it as some kind of backward superstition that's preventing us from being modern people. Right? Both of them would hate the same thing. And Muhammad Abdu himself might use the term bid'ah to describe it, by the way, which kind of complicate things. But what is driving them is, in the one hand, some aspiration to, breaking away from what is seen as backward superstition with a certain understanding of what modernity should look like, and an aspiration to become modern in that sense. And again, I'm using all this with a lot of quote unquote. And then on the other hand, a more kind of purely religious, more theological understanding of, that's the end of the game. I mean, Salafis would be known for taking these kind of purely religious stance, independently of what political conditions dictate. I think my favorite example, of course, you may know this, is to understand how Salafis can completely distinguish theology from politics, is the famous fatwa by Sheikh al-Albani in 1974. In 1974, Sheikh al-Albani is asked about Palestine. What should Palestinians do? Sheikh al-Albani, the foremost Salafi Sheikh of the era, makes an answer that would outrage a lot of people at the time. He says, well, Palestinians should leave Palestine because since they cannot practice their faith in Palestine under occupation, they're not able to be fully Muslims in that context. It is better for them to leave Palestine because it's more important to protect your creed than it is to protect your land. Of course, imagine at the time that lots of people were like, what are you saying? I mean, this is politically outrageous. But of course, he was following it to protect the creed at all costs. Right? So in that sense, I think Muhammad al-Fiqhi used this kind of denunciation of bid'ah. It stops there. He's not aspiring to the same idea of modernity that Muhammad Abdu is aspiring to. For him, it's just a religious. Um, and you can see it when they end up clashing, because so at the beginning you have they have a lot of connection, because in the end they have one common enemy. The Reformists and the Salafis, they're all trying to break free from. I mean, it reminds me sometimes, if you want to think about European metaphor for that, the Lutherans and the Calvinists. That sense, maybe the Calvinists would be the Salafis and the Lutherans would be the Reformists, in a sense, right? And they're all both part of the Protestant movement. And they kind of work with each other, but don't like each other sometimes. I see, and because they all agree on one thing. They want to break with the tradition. Because so to them, the tradition is not a good thing. But they want to break with it for different reasons and with a different. And so that would create links, collaboration sometimes, but eventual clashes, right? I mean, the very interesting clash, of course, is when, so Mahmoud Shaltut is a reformist, belongs to the school of Muhammad Abdu. When he is a young man, he actually works closely with the Salafis, although he's a reformist, but they agree together against traditionalists in a way. But then Mahmoud Shaltut becomes Sheikh al-Azhar. And as Sheikh al-Azhar, he initiates Taqrib, right? So he's the one who launches in the 50s the big project of bringing together the Shia and the Sunni. And I think at least Mahmoud Shaltut is famous for his fatwa, in which he says that the Shia are the fifth school of Islam, the fifth madhab of Islam, right? Yeah. And the Salafis are outraged. How can you be saying something like this from a Salafi perspective, right? So it's like, we thought you were our friends, but I think there was a misunderstanding from the beginning. They just didn't like the traditions for different reasons, but they were not fine for the same things. So I think it's important in the end to look at these. I love Samuli Shilka's book. I don't know if you've read it. Samuli Shilka has a great book on Egypt about the Mawlids and the Salafi attitude to the Mawlids. It's an anthropological study. And what he's showing is how the very modernists, even the secularists in the first half of the 20th century, hate Mawlid just as much as the Salafis, because both of them hate it from a very different perspective. The secularists are like, what is this? This makes us look backward. We want to be like Europeans. We don't want to be doing religious celebrations that, look irrational to them. And the Salafis completely agree with them, but from a different perspective. So Shilka shows a lot of these connections, and people sometimes might use both discourses. They would overlap. They would tell you, well, I don't like this for religious reasons, but it also backwards. So sometimes those two discourses would mix. So in a sense, that's what's complicated with these categories, because sometimes they're blurred. I'm not pretending they're not blurry. I'm just trying to. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very interesting to see how there is overlapping between Salafist and modernist, although for different reasons. But this probably will lead us to another question. Do you think who is probably closer to modernity, who is more, can be in more alignment with modernization? Would it be Salafist or traditionalist? So people will say, okay, Salafi are usually anti-modernity, usually very conservative. Some people will say the radical word. I mean, they are very radical people. But it seems for me that you are saying actually they are more pro-modernity than the traditional Islam or popular Islam with its Sufism, superstitions, or whatever people will call that. Or what's your input on that? Who is probably more inclined to adopt modernity, traditional Islam or Salafism?
I don't want to give certificates of modernity to anyone. I think there are, I'm not absolutely sure what modernity is and how good a thing it is. So at this point, I'm like, I think there's different paths. I think there's not one conception. I think these different people have different understandings of what modernity could be. So in the early 20th century, there is one, and this is under the colonial period, where, in the end, I think to the modernists of the early 20th century, there is one understanding, which is basically, Europe in a sense. Right? But then at the same time, it is their perspective, not mine. Right? And I think in a sense, a lot of people have looked at this and tried to project European history onto this. So, if you want to go up, if you want to push the projection of European history into this, like I did, so basically you have the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and the Catholics. And the three of them are trying to be modern in Europe for the last few centuries. So maybe the traditionalists would be the Catholics,
I'm not sure.
No, I'm sorry for the comparison, but you know what I mean. I mean, in a sense, there's one group that is attached to what it sees as traditions that are non-negotiable. There's one that wants to break with tradition, one that wants to break with tradition with some aspiration, and another one is different aspiration. I'm not saying they're the same. I'm not saying that. But it's the same kind of debate. So if you're asking me, who's more modern between the Catholics, the Lutherans, and like,
I don't know how you would answer that.
It's like, yeah, I think these people have different conceptions of what they I think in a sense everyone, everyone in a sense they're all men of their times. Some of them just see the preservation of tradition as something good, the other ones see it as bad, the other ones see it as sinful. but in a sense, and of course that rhetoric of modernity is probably more used by people around Muhammad Abdu, but yeah, I don't think it's like one is more modern than the other. I think they're all men of their times.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of answering my question. So if we again want to follow up on the same issue, so the relationship or the overlapping, the common ground between Salafist and modernist, you see that, or you say that there was some common ground between both of them. Their hatred to Sufism, their hatred to Mawlid, and so on. But what about the common ground between Salafist and traditionalist? So I think this is something very important. So for example, Usama Sayyid, people know him as Usama al-Azhari probably. You interviewed him in your book, and now he became the Minister of Religious Affairs in Egypt. He has this book about Jamharat Ulama al-Azhar, and in the first volume, he spoke about al-Manhaj al-Azhari, the Azhari methodology. And some of the points are quite interesting that he added to what he calls as Manhaj al-Azhari, that like music is not prohibited, that photography is not prohibited, that triple talaq is considered one talaq, which is Ibn Taymiyyah actually opinion. But we don't notice such juristic debates between Salafists and official Azhari in the beginning of the first century. So your first chapter, for example, it doesn't mention clashes between traditionalism and between Azharis and Salafis in regard to beard, for example, lihya, or in regard to niqab. And here it's really interesting to see the shift, not in the Salafi grammar, I will use one old word, but actually on the official Azhari traditionalism understanding of these juristic issues. So do you agree that there was a very wide space, there's a common ground, there was a common ground between Salafism and modernists, reformists, whatever you will call them. There was also a common ground between Salafist and traditionalist when it comes to juristic debates. That common ground is no longer found in this time, but probably in the early. So, for example, Yusuf al-Dijwi, you mentioned in your first book the debate about Yusuf al-Dijwi and the al-Fiqhi and the debate about Sufism and so on, Bakhit al-Muti'i. But if you look from juristic perspective, you'll find that al-Dijwi in his fatwa say about niqab is obligatory for sure. Something that modern Azharis or current Azharis will never say. And he would say it's obligatory by consensus, ijma'. Because even people say that's not obligatory in the time of fitna, as in our time, it should be obligatory. So there is a consensus on that. So such kind of so-called conservative fatwas was very interesting to see how Salafists actually, or how traditional Islam agreed with Salafis in that, in these issues. Abu al-Fadl al-Jizawi, the Sheikh al-Azhar, he has like these fatwas prohibiting reciting or playing Quran in phonograph. So he said, no, we cannot play Quran on phonograph because phonograph is used for dirty, for filthy issues, for people who are not pious. Uh, Sheikh, if I remember well, Al-Khidr Hussein has another critique of mixing between male and female in education, males and females in education, which looks very similar, like a Salafi rhetoric, but actually from a very traditional official Azharis, which is not the same as it is now. So do you think this categorization, when it comes to juristic, I'm Islamic law student at least, so I'm more interested in juristic debates. So to what extent do you think there was a common ground, the same as there was a common ground between Salafists and Reformists when it comes to the critique of the Sufism? There was also a common ground between Salafists and official Muslim scholars, Azharis, when it comes to as a critique to Reformists. So when it comes to, for example, religious diversity, I mean, I'm sure people, traditional Azhari will be very critical to like joining the celebration of the Christmas, or I don't know one specific fatwa about that, but I'm sure they will be very skeptical about allowing this.
So actually, that's a very good question. In that period, I mean, you're right. There are many things they would agree on. So they disagree on Mawlid, and they disagree on the notion of bid'ah, and can there be bid'ah hasana, and all of this is the big question. And that basically is most of their writing. So, and I think that basically absorbs all their energies. Like this is just what they just keep on writing about this against each other. I think the Al-Azhar and these traditions at Al-Azhar, they're really annoyed by these Salafis who, and some of the Salafis are really offensive. I mean, I talk in the book about Al-Qasimi, right? Abdullah Al-Qasimi. So you have this young student. This is a very interesting story, by the way. So Al-Qasimi is this young student. He's actually from Saudi Arabia. Comes to study in Al-Azhar in 1927. Okay, we're in 1927, 100 years ago. Comes with a scholarship to study at Al-Azhar. And apparently he's a very smart guy, very bold in many ways, and so he comes with this Saudi religious education. Studies at Al-Azhar, and after a while he's like, I hate this. What are they teaching me? It's wrong. And he's a third-year student, and he starts to write a book against Al-Azhar. So he has a couple of books. One is called Shuyukh Al-Azhar wa Ziyada al-Islam. The other one, I forgot and then he writes a book against one of the main sheikhs of Al-Azhar at the time, was Yusuf al-Dijwi. Al-Dhalamat al-Dijwiya. No, Dhalamat. So like, I mean, basically, he's just like, he's a third-year student. It's like if you third-year students at Utiga, you just start to write pamphlets against your professors, not telling you to do this. But, and of course, he's backed by the whole Salafi establishment in Egypt at the time. And so that kind of fuels the polemics. It's very violent in terms of writing, right? They don't. So I think they're so opposed to each other on these questions that they don't really get to see where they see eye to eye. The polemic is really, really strong. It's a very virulent debate. But later on, to respond to your question, I see this later on. It would be too long? No. I see this later on happen. So not at the time. I didn't see any clear case of collaboration. But of course, when like students of Muhammad Abdu, for instance, start to write books about the liberation of women, and of course the traditionalists and the Salafis would agree against this. Most of them. So most of them would agree against this with Muhammad. But I don't see clear cases in which you see this kind of collaboration. Happens later on, and I mentioned this in the book, but long later on, when in 2011, Muhammad Yusri Ibrahim starts to publish these books in which he tries to dig into Al-Azhar on different issues to look for fatwas by Azharis who actually agree with the Salafi point of view. And you see him coming up with a lot of fatwas by Azharis on niqab, exactly, and he says, that means Al-Azhar agrees with the Salafis. This is also very reductive because he's taking just certain issues which have to be real, including traditionalists. Exactly, early Azharis, including traditionalists, and he enrolls them in his campaign to say that, oh, Al-Azhar agrees with us. These Azhari sheikhs say the same thing as us. But again, this is like a late kind of but I don't really see it happening at the time.
Exactly. And this is the point, actually, that this happened later on because probably of the triumph, because of the victory of the reformist group within Al-Azhar itself. So the wing of reformers, the wing of Muhammad Abdu became victorious. I'm sorry, Buri, I didn't notice that we are running out of time. I'm very sorry.
Yeah.
So actually, I raised 2 points out of 10. So, but I will stop here because I think yeah, I'm sorry, because I think there may be people raising their hands. I'm sorry, I didn't notice that. Thank you very much.
We'll have to go for coffee then. For the 8 other points. I'm eager to know them.
This gets more interesting, and I'm sure if I let you, you two, on having discussion, we might end up abandoning the audience. I saw some people already raise hands. Yes. Okay. One in front, and maybe someone in the back row.
Just to push you a bit, Stefan. How much of this is about Egypt? How much of Egypt is in all of this? It struck me in the course of your discussion, for instance, the comparisons you made. There were numerous references to Lutherans and Calvinists, for example, or the instrumental coalitions that we see between traditionalists and Salafis. Go back to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan in power in America. Left-leaning feminists are working with right-leaning American Christian evangelists against pornography. There's nothing uniting them except that one goal. So you see instrumental coalitions popping up. So I'm approaching this from the lens of a political scientist now. And if one were to look at this through the lens of a political scientist, the question, and I'm trying to push you here, is where is the universalism in the processes that you described? Because the contention between traditionalists, Sufis, Salafis, modernists, reformists, these tensions are acted out in the domain of politics. It's all about inclusion, exclusion, cohabitation, cooperation, and what have you. These are political processes. In that sense, they become universal. They become universal. So when I'm listening to you, without the benefit of reading the book, I'm trying to ask myself, if I was a political scientist in Peru, or if I was a political historian in Japan, what can I learn from this? And I think there's a lot, but because the discussion has moved into Egyptiana, in a sense, we've somehow lost that. But it comes out. It comes out again and again, because I see so many parallels in what you've described with the kind of political dynamics, religious political dynamics that we see, at least in this part of the world, in Malaysia and in Indonesia as well. So I'd like you to push you a bit there, right? So what's Egyptian about this, and what's universal about this? I mean, if talk to me as a Peruvian political scientist, and explain to a Peruvian political scientist why this is important, and what can I learn as an Argentinian or a Canadian from this?
Thank you. Should you want me to take more, or just want this one? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Ibu Hurriyah. Thank you, Stefan, for the books. I believe if we read the book, more comprehensive explanation on this topic will reveal more. So my questions is basically moving from the elite, from the ideology into the followers of these groups. So when these Salafist groups either divides or change or transform, what about the followers itself? So this is about the division of the followers of this Salafist group. We know that in Egypt, there are so many political parties from the Salafist group, like An-Nur is one of them, and I forgot the other, but there are some small parties as well. So we know that the transformation of this organization is basically done by the elite, right? But what about the followers after that? My second question is really simple. So how long did it take you to write the book? It's exclude the publication. This is probably questions for me because I don't have any experience in publishing a book. So I think, yeah, that's the second one. Thank you.
Of course, it's very well. Oh, the dinner has all the rights.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. And thank you, Maria. Well, actually, this is to follow up Haula's questions. I had similar things in mind. First, you mentioned about the Islamic Brotherhood and also the Salafis. But I wonder, because you didn't really mention about any specific group. This is also what Haula mentioned. So, are there any specific groups you mentioned in the book? Of course, if I read the book, then I will know. But since we haven't read the book yet, so is there any specific group in terms of Salafism in this context that you would like to make comparison with the Islamic Brotherhood, or it's just Salafism in general? And then secondly, again, this is similar to Bu Haula's question, but she mentioned about followers. But what I would like to know more is about, you talk about the relationship between the state and then Islamic Brotherhood and then the Salafis. But what about the people? What about the, let's say, Muslims, or even ordinary Muslims, or even non-Muslims? Do you portray them? Do you include them in your discussion? Or you just simply neglect them, or what? Could you please explain about it? I think, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So maybe I will start with the last question and I will go in this kind of discussion of last. So Yanuar, excellent question, and that offers me the opportunity to clarify this. It is actually about ordinary people. Like, I mean, what I'm really trying to do in this book is to look at how mainstream conceptions are affected by, competing discourses. So, I mean, you do have organizations, I mentioned a few, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya in 1926, Dawah Salafiyya in the late 1970s, Hizb an-Nur in 2011, I can mention a few more. But, I mean, those organizations are important because those are, entrepreneurs who are actively pushing in the battle of ideas. But I'm also more interested in how ideas redefine people's understanding of their faith. So it's kind of, in a sense, I mean, you do have people who would self-describe as Salafis, and usually those would be part of one of these organizations. But it goes much beyond that, right? There's a lot of, I mean, let's put it this way, many ideas that were promoted by Salafis for the last 100 years have increasingly been seen by a lot of people as mainstream ideas. People who would not describe as Salafis, they would give you a Salafi response to a question you ask. And if you ask them, are you Salafi? They say, of course not. Maybe they don't even know what that is. So what's interesting is that we're looking at something that goes much broader than simply people within the movement who are, the Muslim Brotherhood is a different animal in that sense. Muslim Brotherhood is classical 20th century organization with kind of membership, commitment, it's like, it's been compared to many of these 20th century organizations, right? The Salafism is kind of much more diffuse. I mean, you do have groups and movements who have a program, an agenda, but you also have something that is more the kind of a very liquid type of discourse in many ways, right? Which people just adopt without really necessarily. I mean, if you look at today, just pick one example, and there's many we could mention, but like if you compare what Egyptians today think of Maulid, so when we say Maulid, by the way, it's not just like in Indonesia, Maulid Nabi, but it's also the Maulids of the saints. So Egypt has a very strong tradition of celebrating the saints. So here in Indonesia, I don't think I mean, it's different. You have different traditions, but that one, which is that every year, for the anniversary of the saint, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people sometimes converge to the saint, and they stay there for several days, and it becomes a big form of popular celebration. And this was huge. I mean, in the past, before, when traveling to Mecca was more difficult, more people went to these same pilgrimages than they went to Mecca. It was and some scholars have kind of argued that this kind of replaced pilgrimage to Mecca in the popular mind because people couldn't go to Mecca anyway. It was too far, too complicated, too dangerous. So, I mean, up to maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, most people would probably go there, at least think it's okay to go there, In the 90s, Muhammad used to do that. Today, most people you would ask, they would say, no, this is bid'ah, it's terrible. You shouldn't do that. It's not Islam. So it's interesting, something has shifted, right? The public appreciation of these, in that sense, the notion of what is orthodox has changed, right? So this is really what I'm looking at. In many ways, the book is really more about ordinary Muslims than it is about specific organizations. But of course, specific organizations matter as well because they actively work in that battle of ideas that I'm trying to describe. So this kind of would be my answer. And so that's my answer to Anwar, but also Buhola. In that sense, I agree more with them than, for those of you who read into these, I agree more with them than Viktorovitz. So I think Viktorovitz misses something completely. Like, there's these two trends. There's Salafism and Islamism, and then they start to get intertwined. The 70s, I didn't talk about that in my presentation, but it gets more complicated at some point, because there starts to be mutual influences. And so what he calls politicals are just, either, people following an Islamist grammar of action, but adopting elements of Salafi discourse, which becomes more and more common, because Salafi discourse starts to permeate everything. Or, so the fact that he says there are three types of Salafism, I'm not convinced by that. To me, Salafism is a project of purity, if you define it by what it is fundamentally. And Islamism is a political project. And then these things sometimes can kind of start to mingle and produce new things, with discourse and grammar sometimes being of different nature. You can have like an Islamist grammar of action and a Salafi form of religious substance. So I'm more Heikel than Viktorovitz in that sense, yes, and I explained that a little bit in the book. Also, Buhola, your question as well. The followers of the, again, you have to distinguish between just regular people and the organizations, right? I think I didn't talk about this because I didn't have much time, but these organizations today in Egypt are really weakened. So in terms of organizations, Salafism is in clear crisis today. That is, the heydays of these organizations was really 2011. And for the last 10 years, those organizations have become relatively weak. Which, in a sense, is also linked to the political context in Egypt and everything, right? Which doesn't allow for strong religious organizations to begin with, or political organizations. So there is a real weakening of these organizations, which doesn't mean that many of these ideas are, that's what I say at the end of my book, right? These organizations, but the notions of orthodoxy have a much longer life. Right? So it's not today that everyone will flock back to the Maulids because suddenly Salafi organizations are weakened. Don't expect people to come like in numbers to Sayyid al-Badawi next year like 10 times before because there's no Salafi organizations anymore. So there's two timelines. Timelines of organization is a short timeline. The timeline of ideas is much longer. Where people believe. conceive of things. And again, I'm saying this not normatively, by the way. I always have to insist on that. Right? And none of what I describe I think is a good or a bad. This is not my point. Right? Just trying to be descriptive. And so, yeah, things have changed. And so, even if Salafi organizations are no longer as strong as they were and around to push for this thing, many of these things have changed. Maybe they will change back, you know, but it's a longer timeline. It's not the same timeline. So political change is always much quicker than religious change, if you want to put it that way. Right? You know, the things that change at different speeds, right? So yeah, and the book took me. I started in 2010. So yeah, takes a lot of time. Actually, I was very lucky. So the history of the book, I started in 2010. My first fieldwork in Egypt was May 2010. And so I didn't know a revolution or anything was going to happen.
You didn't plan for it.
I had no idea. And so it was actually quite difficult to work in 2010 back then. Because, and Mohammed mentioned that, right? You know, the revolution was a period in which it was very easy to do fieldwork. No, but very easy to do fieldwork during the revolution. Because suddenly freedom. People would talk, and people would be actually happy to talk. You know, many of these Salafis, they felt that their contribution to Egyptian religious history had been overlooked. There was someone who was telling them, please tell me, what did happen? Of course I'm going to tell you, you know, because we were important, we did this and that. So I was there to record many of these interviews that I could use during that time when people were quite happy to tell that kind of forgotten part of the story. So, and I was taken by surprise. And some people I had interviewed, I saw them like change, you know, people I had interviewed before the revolution, suddenly they became members of Hezbollah. So it was interesting. Like, what happened? Why did you join? So I also had that chance of being able to kind of follow people on the long run. So it just didn't come after the battle. And that's really a chance. I was really lucky. Because sometimes people just study events after they happened, and they just get to, you know, to come back to ask people to recollect what happened. Oh, what did you do and what did you think? And there's always a limit to that because people reconstruct events later on. But I saw them live that. I mean, I remember, you know, having interviews with when Hezbollah was created and the guys were writing the political platform. And there's that moment when they asked me, oh, you're a political science professor. What do you think of our platform? And like, I'm not there to tell you. Is it a good platform? And I'm like, no, I mean, I'm a scholar. I'm not going to tell you if it, as long as you think it's a platform that represents you, it's good. That's, you know, that's the most I can say. So, you know, having these kind of, following along, right? Having the ability to do this kind of long-term work. So I did field work until 2017. And then it took me a lot of time to write because the material was immense. Like, I mean, yeah, it's a century. Like, you'll see this 50 pages of bibliography in Arabic. I went through an enormous amount of things. So the writing process was very, very long. So yeah, it took me some time. So I don't think you should wait 15 years to get a book published, by the way. I don't think it's I don't recommend it. It's not my first book, so I had a previous one. No. Yeah. 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 So yeah, it's I did other smaller books in the meantime, and other projects in the meantime. That's also what happens when you grow more senior. You start to have many projects at the same time. So you cannot really just focus on the book all the time. You've got to do other things. Your question, Farish. So this is a wonderful question, and I think this is really where I'm trying to go right. That is, of course I agree with you. Of course I agree with you, right? And I've never believed that there was nothing exceptional to these stories. And I kind of hinted at that when I came up with my comparisons that Mohammed was not very convinced of, with the Lutherans and the Catholics and the Calvinists. But yeah, I mean, there's, you know, of course, you know, you don't compare these groups, you know, on the same basis, different theologies, different contexts. But of course, there are common dynamics in these debates that happened everywhere. I mean, the same questions about, you know, modernity and tradition, they just happened everywhere, and they were framed in terms that was different according to each one's theology and context and political conditions. And so the story I'm telling, I don't think is exceptional at all. I completely agree. And even, I mean, the question of religion and politics, I don't think, you know, some people have this idea that there is something exceptional within the Islamic context about how the question of politics is asked. But actually, when you dig into Christianity, same questions have been asked. You know, this is like, I mean, I don't want to make everything the same, because it's not, and histories are different, but many of the questions are not specific to one religion. And so, so I think my next book will somehow try to be a response to your question. In many ways, that's one of the reasons why I was interested in coming to Indonesia, because at least within the Islamic sphere, Indonesia was a way to, within a very different cultural and historical context, start to think about these things and move away from the Arab world that I know quite well, whatever, you know, that I've been studying for a long time, and maybe next time I should do fieldwork in Peru. So my next sabbatical I take in Peru, and then I can have a full understanding of these things. Of course, of course. Well, I mean, look, Twilight, the Twilight on the Mosque of Cairo was just, I couldn't, you know, it's such a beautiful picture. You know, of course, but so I could, but yeah, you're right. That maybe the picture has something, especially on the French book. It's better. I don't know what they did. They changed the colors a little bit in the English edition to make it even more Orientalist looking. But I didn't plan that. That wasn't my. But no, but I completely agree with what you said, and I often tell my students that when I was writing my PhD about Saudi Arabia, the book that opened my eye, so that made me understand what I was doing on Saudi Arabia, was a book about Solidarność in Poland. And I told this, I think, to TK students when we were talking. I said, you know, read about things that have nothing to do with what you're doing, because this is how you understand what you're doing. Like if you keep rereading about what you're doing, you're just stuck in that. You know, I wrote this book about Solidarność in Poland, and suddenly I was like, this is what I'm doing. This is what's happening. Suddenly I could put words on things that I was too stuck within my topic, you know, within this illusion of exceptionalism. Suddenly I look at Poland and it has nothing to do. We're in Poland. It was not Saudi Arabia. This is a different thing. We're 1981, like Walesa, you know, labor union movement, democracy, democratization. And suddenly the same processes are going on. Suddenly everything makes sense. So yeah, I completely agree with you. Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, hopefully the next project is taking me in that direction.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I know we're running out of time, but I would like to invite questions from audience if there's, okay. One, is there anyone else from the back row? Well, okay, two.
Okay, my name is Asep. I'm from Faculty of Social Science. I have two questions. The first is about that entrepreneurial spirit of Salafism, because when I started my undergrad in Yogyakarta, it was the first time of Islamic revival phase in Indonesia, that suddenly my friend started to wear hijab, female friends, and fast forward right now, I can say that Salafism is the most popular part of Islam for the new hijrah people in my close friend. So when my close friend, for example, resigned from bank, then she or he decided to do more religious thing, they will instantly join Salafism. At the beginning, I was full of skepticism because my religious training in Pondok Pesantren. But then recently, I incline more to the Salafi mosque in Jakarta, and my very impression when I entered the mosque is that the carpet smell good, and that is for me it is like the end of discussion. I'm no longer thinking about theological debate or something else, but in practical reason, the carpet smell good, and then they manage the money very well compared to other religious institutions from Indonesia in managing the mosque. So my question is that entrepreneurial spirit was originated in Salafism? It is true that the entrepreneurial spirit has been becoming the more attractive part of the Salafism in Egypt, for example. So I want to know more about that entrepreneurial spirit in Salafism. And secondly, Muhammad mentioned about official Islam, and maybe in Egypt we can say that Al-Azhar was very well established in forming that official Islam. But in Indonesia, we can say that maybe Triple IU was quite late in forming that official Islam. So if we talk about Salafism in Indonesia, and we can say that there is no such thing as official Islam in Indonesia, because there is no such institution such as Al-Azhar, how do you see that prospect of Salafism in Indonesia without such well-established institution such as Al-Azhar? So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for this wonderful presentation. I have a question, even though I have attended halfway. My question is with regard to why is it that the Salafi ideology, or I can say the Salafi movement, is more pronounced with related to Saudi, while we have it that, according to history, the popularity of Salafi in the modern sense, it was started in Egypt through the works of Muhammad Abdu and the like. And also even Muhammad Nasiruddin al-Albani, who has become one of the most influential Salafi authority, has been influenced by the writings of this particular modernist of Egypt, especially through readings their journal of Manara, and also like the verification of hadith that become a lifetime experience of Al-Albani, has been started by an Egyptian scholar named Ahmad Shakir. So I want to know, why is it that now Salafism is mostly attached to Saudi whenever Salafism is mentioned, while its first seed was sown in Egypt? So that's my question. Thank you for this presentation, Prof.
Thank you very much. Should we take a, yep. I'm not sure I got, can you just summarize your first question in just a sentence to make sure I get it right?
Because my impression when I enter Salafi mosque, the carpet is smell good, and also they manage the money very good, much better than mosque that managed by another Islamic organization in Indonesia. Is that entrepreneurial spirit also becoming the origin of Salafism elsewhere in Egypt, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, there's a different number of elements here, which I think might explain that. So basically, from what I understand, and it was the case in Egypt in many ways as well, Salafism attracts very different profiles from what traditional religious organizations attract. So usually if people who actually haven't gone through formal Islamic education, and I'm thinking here about also an article we've been working on with Payanuar, so usually it's people who don't have that same kind of training, who tend to be professionals, many of them actually working in the private sector. So they tend to come from very different backgrounds. And here in Indonesia, from what I understand, and I may be wrong, there tends to be a very strong class element, like it's kind of a middle upper class type of movement, which is not always the case in Egypt, which is interesting. In Egypt, you have different types of Salafisms. You have like a really kind of a working class Salafism, which is kind of distinct from a middle upper class Salafism. So, but of course, maybe this class element plays in, the background of these people play in. I mean, it's kind of pretty obvious that, yeah, I mean, what I described in the 20s and 30s, when these people, they come from a very different background. They're not products of traditional education. So maybe it makes them kind of more in tone with the use of whatever modern means there is, which may also mean, you know, more familiar with market techniques, more familiar with, you know, of their days. So the fact that they're kind of out of the traditional forms of religious education and more in tune with whatever the market is. I don't know if that works and if that's the case. I mean, you would need to ask about the profiles of these people to make sure this is what you see, but and yeah, and the second question, sorry, I'm getting about Al-Azhar and oh yeah, and in Indonesia, yeah. I mean, I think in Indonesia, again, this is really, I don't like to talk about things I haven't studied properly, and I don't feel like I have enough knowledge or authority to say anything here, but what I feel is that there is one big difference in Indonesia, which is really the existence for the last century of a very strong and organized traditionalist organization. Because there's nothing such in Egypt. The traditionalists, when they join the battle against the Salafis in the 20s, they're dispersed, they're scattered, they don't have a common effort, you know, there's not that kind of structure. So although you don't have official Islam in Indonesia, you do have two big Islamic organizations that function in some way. Although it's not official, but still with structure, the Islamic sphere in Indonesia, right? And one of them is a major traditionalist organization that has its legitimacy, its history, its centrality. And I think that kind of explains probably why, in many ways, but again, this is really very preliminary and I would need to think about this more, and so I shouldn't even be saying this, but I could explain why Salafism has not been successful in Indonesia in the same way it has been in places where there was not this kind of traditionalist challenge. So I think in Indonesia, things have always been much more balanced in that kind of, and the reformist challenge as well. So you had those different factions in Indonesia as well. Reformist Muhammadiyah as well were there. So there was a much kind of more, yeah, like the counter movements to Salafism were much more organized and influential here. But again, this is just me thinking at this point, and I may consider in a year that what I'm saying is wrong. So I don't want to say more. As for Adi's question, right? So, I mean, it's a good question. I like it because, in a sense, you're right? And I always say, like in my book, these Salafis in Egypt in the 1920s, they're not just Wahhabis. They're Taimiy's Wahhabis. That is, there is a strong tradition that doesn't come really from Saudi Arabia. It comes from Iraq and Syria, which David Cummins has written beautifully in a book about late Ottoman Syria and the rediscovery of Ibn Taymiyyah in late Ottoman Syria. People like in Iraq, there's Nu'man al-Alusi, the Alusi family. There's the Jamaluddin al-Qasimi in Syria. Those are Taimiyis. They're not Wahhabis. And this is kind of the tradition to which Al-Albani, who comes from Syria, belongs. So the rediscovery of Ibn Taymiyyah and the quest for purity is not an exclusively Saudi thing, right? It comes actually, it's multi-centric at the beginning at least. But of course, Saudi Arabia, because it has a state, and because later on it has resources, would gradually, you know, kind of become the epicenter, the unique epicenter of that originally multi-centric movement. But the original, and there would be differences, by the way. There would be differences till the end. Sheikh Al-Albani would disagree with the Saudi Salafis on certain things. Al-Albani, for instance, never thought that niqab was obligatory. And the Saudi Salafis were outraged. But he came from a different Syrian Salafi tradition, you know, of course, different conditions, you know, so there's this big book actually that created a big scandal when he published it. It's called Hijab al-Mara al-Muslima, which is a book on niqab. Now Albani takes a stance against it. And he's in Saudi Arabia at the time, and the Saudi Salafis are like, no, you can't say that. This is not Salafism. So you can see that within Salafism, there were different strains and traditions, but they were they were all driven by the quest for purity. But it's not like monolithic. Although the Saudi Arabia would play a role as epicenter to try to systematize it. So, but you're right, to point out the fact that, you know, this is not just a story about Saudi Arabia. And in my book, I don't make it about Saudi Arabia that much. One of the things I get in my book is like, you don't talk about Saudi Arabia enough. Because I don't talk about it more than I think it's necessary to talk about it. Because I think people talk about it all the time. And by talking about it all the time, they miss what's actually happening on the ground. It's not just like some masterminds sitting in Riyadh and deciding for what's going to happen in the world. It's not like that. It's much more complicated than that. There's many intertwined histories coming from different parts. So thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen, and also the audience. I know we still have many things that we want to explore from Stephen's book, but we already passed the time limit. So I have regretfully end this session. And I would also like to thank you all for being part of today's rich and engaging discussion. Special thank you to Stephen for a very compelling presentation, and also Muhammad Al-Marakebi for your thoughtful and also insightful comments. Yes, and I have the honor to moderate this today's discussion. So today's discussion has already, give us a lot of information about what happened in Egypt during the what Stephen called there's a void and also a demand for religious change in Egypt. And I hope today's discussion not only spark our interest and also our discussion about Egypt, but we can also continue the discussion beyond Egypt, beyond this room, and also beyond this book. And hopefully we can meet again in another discussion. As a moderator, I would like to thanks again for Pak Yanwar as a dean for the faculty the dean of the Faculty of Islamic Studies at UI 3, and also for the audience for your presence, for your questions, and also for your engaging discussion. Thank you, everyone. I end up this discussion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.